Everyone, this is update for December 18, 2022, day 298 of the war and of the date update. So there's not much what's going on over a weekend. It's just kind of catch up for both days. Yesterday, December 17, and today, December 18. So I'll touch a little bit on strategic topics, and we're actually going to start with Africa. We haven't really talked about it much. I spoke about it once in July when I was discussing Wagner mercenaries. So what's going on is essentially there's a going on kind of like how to say, unnoticeable or invisible fight for Africa between, say, Europe, US on one side, and then China and Russia on the other side. So the way mm, the fight is happening is China is almost strictly economical financial approach, right? They building ports, they renting land to have the potential in the future military bases there. Um, you know, U.S. was kind of almost out of Africa in many ways, and then Europe is still present because of the old colonial sort of influence that it still maintains, specifically mostly through France. And then Russia recently, just sort of, say, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years ago, maybe seven, they just got there and they're actually using sort of military force to gain control and influence in Africa. And the tool for that military force is Wagner mercenaries. So what they managed to do, they managed to push, let's say, Europe and France out of Mali, this country, and then Burkina Faso so far. Also Central African Republic. So essentially they're there, and the key places for, let's say, France is this Niger here, because it has deposit of the uranium, which, for those who know, France has a lot of nuclear power stations. So essentially that's a source material or fuel for, well, not, it's not really fuel, but like raw material to make fuel rods for nuclear power stations, basically. So now with Russia kicking out French out of these two countries, the next is actually going to be Niger. That's going to be where they will try to push France out to gain control of those uranium deposits there, and also Senegal to get actually access to the ocean, essentially. And there they may actually work together with China. So this is what's going on here. U.S. And China. What China does, just want to kind of a little bit describe what China does at the same time. They gain a lot of sort of influence by basically, I would say, almost like a bribing local governments and giving them money in exchange for gaining some, for building, power station um, or let's say getting a port or something like that. So they do every 3 year, sort of like a summit. I don't know how you call it better, where with the representative African governments, and so that's a tool for them to maintain access and gain more access to Africa. So basically, from perspective like Europe and US completely neglected Africa over past whatever, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years, or they just were not focused there. Then now they waking up and like, oh well, essentially Africa is almost controlled by China, or in danger of almost full control by China and Russia. So US just did this Africa summit a couple days ago. This was the previous one was 8 years ago, but essentially this is just a sort of very poor attempt to reestablish influence in Africa, which doesn't look like it's gonna go that far. There was some success for the U.S., so they they gained control over cobalt deposits in Congo. Actually, not sure if it's Democratic Republic of Congo or just Congo, but basically, I believe it's Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was kind of like, I would say, some limited success there, and then Europe and France is essentially on retreat from Africa, and partially that retreat was because the nuclear was not viewed as sort of green or alternative energy, and so then, okay, if you don't need it, you don't want to invest, resources in maintaining military presence and so on in this part, and so that's why part of the reason why Wagner mercenaries managed to quickly gain so much influence and access in Africa. So this is just kind of like a little bit of um, you know a little bit more addition to kind of like big picture what's going on in the world, because I usually talk a lot about China and that part of the world, obviously Ukraine, and we're gonna be, but there's war, and it's sort of, let's say, invisible war that's going on in Africa as well at the same time between these two alliances. Now let's switch actually to Ukraine. Well, I'm not going to totally switch to Ukraine, but just want to mention that Russian president is coming on December 19 to Belarus, which is up north of Ukraine, which is essentially kind of like extension of Russia in very sort of primitive, simple way to say it, but it's just Russia has so much economic, political, financial influence over Belarus that essentially it's a puppet state. Nevertheless, there is a formal independence maintained for the purposes of international affairs, because it gives you two votes instead of one, and more sort of more support. Let's put it this way. So, Russian president is going to meet Belarus president on December 19. This is very unusual because before the Belarus president would usually go to Russia. So very unusual event, and many believe that this is related to this future attack or expected or whatever contemplated attack again from Belarus. So basically, second coming to Kiev by Russian troops. I would say that's very unlikely, almost like extremely unlikely scenario. Just right now, Russia does not have enough resources or does not have enough manpower to do that, because to capture Kiev, you need probably at least 500,000 troops. At bare minimum 400, and it's probably chances are going very low. So Russia does not have that right now in readily available with enough military equipment and so on. So extremely unlikely. Belarus army is unwilling to fight. First of all, the units that could be sort of conditionally suitable for this are basically, I think, 2 or 3 brigades, probably more like 3, 4 brigades, which the total number of those is about like pushing 15,000. So definitely more, even like probably between 10 to 15,000. So it's really nothing there to be sort of scared or worried about at this moment. Uh, just want to mention briefly another interesting development between China and the U.S. U.S. Parliament now requires U.S. Intelligence agencies to provide information on corruption and wealth of Chinese top. So you can imagine that's another sort of huge irritation, probably on a personal level, for Chinese leadership, because obviously, as you can imagine, there's a tons of corruption there. Basically, that's just another sort of level of escalation on a personal level this time. Now let's actually switch to Ukraine. First, about the power grid in Ukraine. So it's still there, did not disintegrate, but it's largely in coma. and obviously Russia just preparing for another round of attacks. So maybe take another attack or maybe a couple, but it looks like Russia is very determined to basically disintegrate the Ukrainian power grid into several islands, and then eventually, one by one, sort of destroy those islands. But the most important goal is actually isolate nuclear power stations. So basically, so they stop, and because they produce cheap, extremely reliable energy, always available. Or, well, not perfectly actually always, but it's you know the more important is that they cheap and very reliable. So and they produce significant portion of Ukrainian electricity power generation. So the point is to isolate those three remaining nuclear power station, and then that's the next sort of strategic goal here, and that will really essentially bring Ukrainian power grid and power distribution system um, to couple small islands, and that's pretty much it. Now let's switch to the battlefield, and we'll do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion. So along the state border is more or less quiet, with exception of some Ukrainian attacks in Belgorod. This is regional center here of this Belgorod region, Belgorod region, which would be in Ukrainian. Um, as I said many times before, all of these attacks are just essentially propaganda sort of tools. They don't provide any military or strategic sort of usefulness or advantage to Ukrainian side. Just really waste of resources. But nevertheless, they done for probably propaganda purposes, as I mentioned before. Now let's actually jump to North Luhansk front line. Since here are more or less the same, as you can see, Russian troops are attacking. Here around this Mavkivka region is essentially meeting engagement between two sides, with both sides still maintaining status quo. In both cases, on all of this front line, the status quo remains here. Now let's move south. Let's see what's going on the North Donbass front line. Things here are pretty active, as you can see. Wagner mercenaries actively attacking pretty much at all main sort of points here. The key is they are trying to sort of, as you can see, they're trying to exploit this salient that they created, that's sort of around this village Pidgorodny and Paraskovivka. So, but so far they were not successful today, which, as I said many times, doesn't mean really anything. Then they are also actively attacking south of Bakhmut, because this is the most promising at this point opportunity, because if they drive up sort of this like northwestern direction, they're really creating threat to Bakhmut. Because this attack here straight from east is just really to keep pressure on Ukrainian command and prohibit the withdrawal of the potential reinforcements from this area to south and potentially a little bit north. The Ukrainian troops also nevertheless managed to do some counterattack directed at Ozyryanivka, which failed, which I said many times how it doesn't work for Ukrainian side, and the way it's being done, it's sort of never gonna work. By the way, I just forgot to mention. So it looks like Ukrainian Parliament passed the law that I was mentioning probably like 3-4 days ago, that essentially puts Ukrainian soldiers in the on the same kind of like level with Wagner mercenaries, where basically if you don't follow something blindly, you're going to jail for 12 years basically. That's and basically what it requires is just blind following of the commanders, which I mentioned many times before, are of extremely poor quality in Ukrainian army, and that's one of the main reasons why the performance is so I would say terrible, in a way that Ukraine is suffering so many losses being on defensive, because typically the ratio or relationship between the losses of the defender and offender significantly favors defender, like at least 1 to 3. That's a normal and typical. Basically, the offender loses 3 more times the sort of attacking forces soldiers than the defender, right? And in general, it's obviously easier to defense is easier thing. But as you can see, mm, Ukrainian side is outnumbering still Russian side, right? And defending and still suffering heavy losses in terms of soldiers and everything. And this is really the problem. In the root cause is this the Soviet military top, the generals that like Ukrainian army, I think, has like more generals than any other army. Just basically they created out of thin air, don't really, not for the merits, let's put this way. And so that's where really the root cause and the problem. And then, as you know, the fish rots from the top always. So and then it kind of like all goes down, because if you have inept and I would say unintelligent um, commanders, then everything else sort of kind of like they select the same kind of like people for the middle level, and then lower level commanders. So that's just that's what you get. And then there's also pretty much very poor training, let's say, on Ukrainian side. Sometimes actually no training, but soldiers literally go like thrown, like you were mobilized 1 week and you're already on the front line. To be fair, Russian side is exactly the same. There's no difference. In many ways, the Russian side even worse, because it's all uh, there's even more, mm, I would say, bureaucracy on the Russian side, and mindless following orders, versus Ukrainian side, because at the Ukrainian side, at the sort of grassroots, at soldier level, there's much more common sense as opposed to the Russian side. But nevertheless, the point is that this law is actually attempt to, in many ways, to cover up failure of Ukrainian military top by basically forcing ordinary people, Ukrainian soldiers, to sacrifice their lives, mm, you know, to cover up for their mistakes, or not even mistakes. I would say, in many ways, it's just criminal, and it's just very similar to how it was in the Soviet Union in 1941, or 1942, where the Soviet army was basically plugging defensive lines with the bodies of the soldiers, and there was also this infamous, Order 227, which basically, you're gonna get shot, and if you try to retreat. But actually, even before that order, it was already being basically practiced by the army. It was just sort of formalized because it was issued, I think, in like July of 1942 or August 1942. But those sort of those units that were basically shooting in your back if you try to retreat, they were pretty much always there. That was kind of like sort of really feature of the Soviet army, even like in the during sort of so-called revolution in 1917 slash dash 1921. That was very wide practice in the sort of red or communist army. But anyway, so this, as you can see, this where the roots are coming from right now. So all of this Soviet communist mentality that still lives and basically doesn't allow Ukraine to live. And that's part of the reason why I'm saying that Ukraine is going to this 1917 moment, the same as Russia does, because that's the way for them to get rid of um, all of this sort of negative plague that happened in 1917. So, anyways, that's the situation on this on the North Donbass front line. And sort of so far, as I would summarize it, things are slowly deteriorating for Ukrainian side, and while the loss, in terms of the loss of Bakhmut, I would say if Ukrainian side loses it, it's not going to be anything sort of critical, not the end of the world. This probably would going to be more sort of mm, moral blow to the country, to the population, like, because there is a lot of you know people who really don't understand situation on the front line. They almost feel like, okay, we're winning, it's just going to take another little bit time to kick out Russian side from Ukraine. So basically, like, everything's kind of like um, you know how to say, uh, the pass is we just need to execute. Everything is gonna everything is sort of, the problem is basically resolved. It's just gonna take a little bit more pain to really get there. While it's actually totally not true, and situation is still like kind of up in the air where it's gonna fall out, really. Um, okay, let's move to the central Donbass front line. Things here are somewhat more active. I would say uh, possible to single out that Russian command decided to really focus on this sort of southern portion of this central Donbass front line, specifically Marinka, Novomikhailivka, almost abandoned this Pitski salient, and their plan to sort of capture Avdiivka. Really, the focus is here. Uh, there are reports that Russian troops made some advances in Marinka. Basically, just like capture another quarter, another like 100 meters of this extremely large village, or like small town. I don't know which way, what's the best describes it. Probably small town. So they slowly moving, advancing in Marinka. Let's put it this way. There's huge effort here, as you can see, and that there's couple Russian divisions attacking here and so on. So I would say it's very clear, like if you compare Wagner mercenaries, how they perform versus regular Russian army. If there were Wagner mercenaries here of the same quantity, they probably already punched through this defensive line. And that just kind of gives you understanding why this entrepreneurial approach of the Wagner mercenaries is a huge advantage relative to bureaucratic, disempowered approach of the Russian army and also Ukrainian army the same way. Now let's move to Zaporizhya front line. Things here are the same, sort of sleepy. No essential changes on this in this area. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow. Bye bye.